There's a specific kind of fear that doesn't have a name. It's not the fear of dying, it's not the fear of failing, it's the fear of one day walking into a room that used to go quiet when you entered, and nobody turning to look, nobody recognizing the face, nobody knowing the name. For most people, that fear lives quietly in the background. For Julio Iglesias, it was the engine behind everything, the tours that never stopped, the albums that kept coming, the stages he refused to leave even as his body aged around him. He wasn't performing because he loved the spotlight. He was performing because the moment the spotlight went dark, he didn't know who he was without it. Most people build an identity over time, through relationships, through work, through the slow accumulation of choices that eventually add up to a self. Julio Iglesias built his identity in a hospital bed. At 22 years old, with 2 years of enforced stillness and a guitar he could barely hold. Before the accident, he had been a goalkeeper for Real Madrid's youth team, athletic, physical, defined by movement. Then a car crash took all of that away in a single night. For 2 years, he couldn't walk properly, couldn't play football, couldn't be the person he had been. And in that void, music filled the space so completely that by the time he recovered, there was no longer a version of Julio that existed without it. This is important, not as biography, but as psychology. When your identity is forged in a moment of loss, when the thing that saved you is also the thing that defines you, the line between who you are and what you do becomes impossible to find. Julio didn't have a career in music. He was music, which meant that any threat to the career wasn't just a professional problem. It was an existential one. By the early 1980s, Julio Iglesias was arguably the most successful recording artist on the planet. Not in one country, not in one language. Globally, he had sold more records in more languages than anyone in history. The Guinness Book of World Records made it official. And yet, if you had been in a room with him during those years, the people closest to him would tell you the same thing. He was never satisfied, not in the way that driven people are never satisfied, that restless hunger for the next challenge. This was different. This was closer to panic wearing the mask of ambition. Every sold-out arena was evidence that tonight he hadn't been forgotten. Every platinum record was proof that the world still knew his name. But the proof expired quickly. It always does. And so the machine had to keep running. Another album, another tour, another city, another crowd that needed to scream his name so he could feel certain for a few hours that he still existed in people's minds. The people around him watched the schedule with a kind of quiet alarm. Cities blurred into each other. Sleep became something that happened between flights rather than in beds. He sang in languages he had learned phonetically, in countries where he didn't speak a word of the local tongue, to audiences who didn't share a single cultural reference with him, and somehow made them feel that he was singing directly to them. The gift was real, but so was the need driving it. The moment that revealed everything came not from failure, but from a specific kind of success that still felt like insufficiency. In 1984, Julio released To All the Girls I've Loved Before with Willie Nelson. It became a massive hit in America, the one market that had always remained slightly out of reach, the one audience whose recognition carried a particular weight in the global imagination. He had arrived. By any reasonable measure, the fear should have quieted. The world's biggest market now knew his name. It didn't quiet. If anything, it got louder. Because here's what nobody tells you about achieving the thing you thought would finally be enough. It isn't. The relief lasts perhaps a week, perhaps a month, and then the mind recalibrates, raises the bar, and the fear returns wearing a slightly different face. Now, it wasn't, will America know my name? It was, will they still know it next year? In 5 years? When the voice changes? When the face ages? When the next generation arrives with its own sound and its own stars? People close to him noticed something during this period. In interviews, Julio had always been charming, deflective, comfortable redirecting conversation toward humor or romance. But when journalists pushed him, really pushed him, on the subject of legacy, of what happened when it ended, something flickered behind the eyes. Not anger, not defensiveness. Something closer to a door he didn't want opened. I will never stop, he said in one interview, laughing as he said it, which is what you do when you're telling the truth but don't want anyone to take it seriously. Never. I will die on a stage somewhere, and that will be fine with me. He was laughing. He wasn't joking. The cruelest mirror for that fear arrived not from a rival, not from a critic, not from a changing music industry, but from his own son. When Enrique Iglesias began his rise in the mid-1990s, the world did what the world always does. It made it a competition. Father versus son. Old guard versus new generation. The Latin crooner versus the pop king. Every chart position was analyzed through the lens of replacement. Every Enrique success was framed, somewhere, as a Julio decline. What made this unbearable wasn't the rivalry itself. It was the timing. Enrique was rising precisely as Julio was entering the phase of his career where the question of legacy, of what remains, of whether you are remembered, becomes impossible to ignore. And here was his own son, younger, faster, more fluent in the language of the moment, pulling the exact same audiences that Julio had once owned. The public narrative was father-son rivalry. The private reality was something more complicated. Julio watched his son succeed and felt two things simultaneously, in the way that only family can make you feel two contradictory things at once: genuine pride and a fear so specific it had no name. Not the fear that Enrique would surpass him, though that was part of it. The deeper fear was what Enrique's rise confirmed: that audiences move on, that the world replaces its heroes with younger ones, that the spotlight, no matter how long you've stood in it, eventually finds someone else to illuminate. He never said this publicly. He was too skilled a performer to let that show. But the schedule got busier, the tours got longer, the albums came faster. A man trying to outrun something that cannot be outrun. The shift, when it came, didn't arrive through therapy or revelation or a single clarifying moment. It arrived, as most real shifts do, through repetition. Through the slow accumulation of ordinary days that eventually added up to something he hadn't expected, a life that existed when the music stopped. Miranda had been building that life alongside him for years, quietly, without announcement, without demanding that he notice. 5 children who called him dad rather than legend. Mornings that began not with a set list or a sound check, but with breakfast noise and small arguments about nothing important. A house that was lived in rather than occupied between flights. And gradually, so gradually that he couldn't have pointed to the moment it changed, Julio began to discover something that his fear had always prevented him from finding. That there were people in the world for whom his continued existence mattered not because of what he could do, but simply because he was there. His children didn't need Julio Iglesias the icon. They needed their father, and their father, the actual man, not the performer, was someone who had been largely absent, but who, late and imperfectly, was learning to show up. This is not a comfortable realization for a man who has spent 50 years defining himself through achievement and recognition. It requires a kind of surrender that fame makes almost impossible. The admission that being known by thousands means very little if the people across your dinner table don't actually know you. That applause fades the moment it ends, but a child who feels seen by their parent carries that forward for a lifetime. He didn't stop performing. He never did. But something in the performance changed. The urgency softened slightly. The need to prove, to the audience, to himself, to the fear, loosened its grip. Just enough. Here is what's worth understanding about a fear like Julio's. It isn't vanity. People dismiss it as vanity. The aging star who can't let go. The performer who needs the crowd because his ego demands it. That reading is too easy, and it misses the point entirely. The fear of being forgotten is, at its core, the fear of having mattered. Of having burned so brightly, given so much, poured so much of yourself into something, and then watching the world simply move on as if none of it happened. It's the fear that love, even when it's real, even when it's earned, is ultimately temporary. That the world's attention is borrowed, never owned. That you can fill 10,000 seats every night for 50 years and still wake up at 3 a.m. wondering whether any of it meant anything permanent. Most people carry a version of this fear. They just don't have a stage to perform it on. They carry it into offices, into relationships, into the work they do and the children they raise, and the quiet, desperate hope that something they built will outlast them. Julio Iglesias just carried it further, and louder, and in more languages than anyone else in history. What changes, what can change, if you're lucky and you live long enough, is not the fear itself. The fear doesn't disappear. What changes is your relationship to it. whether it drives you or whether you drive it, whether it makes your decisions or whether you make them despite it. Julio Iglesias is in his 80s now. He still speaks about performing as though stopping were unthinkable. Maybe it is. Maybe the stage is still the only place the fear goes quiet. But there is also, now, a house with grandchildren in it. A woman who has chosen him every day for 40 years. A son he finally learned to be a father to, imperfectly and late but genuinely. A life that exists in the silences between the music rather than only inside it. The world's most famous voice spent decades terrified of being forgotten. What he found, slowly and at con.